Your grandfather could walk into the forest with an axe, a mule, and a crosscut saw and legally do things that would now trigger federal fines, environmental violations, and armed inspections. We're counting down 25 of those old lumberjack skills, from river drives and backyard sawmills to dynamite felling and community timber harvest, each one now restricted, regulated, or outlawed across most of the country. Some carry fines in the hundreds, others could cost you $250,000. As the countdown climbs, so do the stakes, the penalties, and the cultural losses. Starting at number 25 with a practice that turned America's rivers into highways until the federal government shut them down. In the 25th place, floating logs downriver once turned rivers like the Penobscot and the Columbia into living highways. Each spring, crews of so-called river pigs braved cold water and shifting currents, balancing atop spinning logs, steering thousands of tons of timber toward distant mills. This was not just a spectacle, it was survival. Whole towns depended on the log drive, from the sawyers upstream to the mill hands at the river's end. But when the Clean Water Act's 1978 whole log equals fill amendment hit, the ritual that built Maine's fortunes fell under federal scrutiny. Now, every trunk counted as a pollutant, every log jam a violation. Permits became nearly impossible to secure, and fines could reach $10,000 a day. In 1991, the Maine DEP slapped a $45,000 penalty on a Penobscot drive for bypassing the new regime. By 1980, log drive volume in Maine had plunged by 96%. The last Kennebec drive rolled out in 1976, closing the book on a trade that once defined the frontier's edge. In the 24th place, cutting timber without federal marking once meant a man could walk into the woods, carve his initials into the bark, and claim a tree as his own. On federal land, this tradition ended when the Forest Service replaced bark marks with permanent metal tags. No tag, no timber, no questions asked. After 1979, regulations under 36 CFR Section 219.30 demanded every tree cut from public forests be stamped and logged in paperwork, turning a handshake and a hatchet into a felony if the rules weren't followed. The old-timers called it creeping red tape. The woods filled with inspectors, and every load of logs needed a trail of documents just to leave the forest. By 1985, the number of independent crews working federal land had dropped by nearly a third. In 44 states, unmarked cutting carries penalties up to $5,000 per tree, enough to bankrupt a family crew on a single haul. The legend of a $250,000 fine in Murray, Idaho, still circulates in timber towns, a warning that the days of quiet, unrecorded harvests are over. In the 23rd place, backyard sawmills once stood at the heart of rural independence. Families built water wheel rigs beside creeks or fired up portable steam engines to turn fallen timber into boards for barns, cabins, and local trade. These makeshift mills, sometimes no more than a belt-driven saw under a tin roof, kept entire communities supplied with lumber through hard winters and lean years. But the arrival of OSHA's 1974 machine guard rules and the EPA's 1976 sawdust disposal standards changed everything. Suddenly, every spinning blade needed a certified guard, every dust pile counted as hazardous waste, and a single missing shield could trigger a $13,653 fine. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act classified sawdust as a regulated material, demanding collection systems far beyond the means of most family crews. By 1980, more than 85% of small mills had shuttered, and the old water wheel demonstrations survived only as museum pieces. Today, in 43 states, operating a sawmill without full licensing is not just risky, it is illegal. The hum of the backyard mill, once the soundtrack of self-reliance, has fallen silent under the weight of codes and compliance. In the 22nd place, burning slash piles once marked the end of every big cut. Crews stacked limbs, bark, and treetops into towering heaps, then set them alight, sending columns of smoke curling over the hills. For generations, these fires cleared ground for new growth and made way for cabins or planting. But the smoke didn't stop at the tree line. By the late 1970s, the Clean Air Act's hazardous air pollutant amendment swept in, targeting open-air burns as a threat to public health. States followed, layering on burn bans and permit regimes. Now, a single unauthorized slash burn can bring a $2,000 fine, and in 41 states, the practice is banned outright. The numbers tell the story. Between 1970 and 1995, slash burning declined by 92% nationwide. What was once a tool of forest renewal became a crime scene, and the old burn pits, so vivid in sepia film, stand cold and overgrown, reminders of a world where fire was both a necessity and a risk. In the 21st place, building a log cabin from raw forest timber once stood as the clearest mark of a self-made life. Families would clear land, notch fresh-cut pine or spruce with an axe, and raise walls by hand. No blueprints, no permits, just sweat and know-how passed down through generations. These cabins weren't weekend getaways. They were home, sheltering children from winter storms and anchoring entire communities in the woods. But the era of the hand-built homestead faded as building codes tightened their grip. The International Residential Code, updated in 1975, began demanding fire-retardant treatments and engineered structural assemblies for any new log construction. County inspectors arrived, tape measures in hand, and what once was a birthright became a bureaucratic labyrinth. Today, in most states, an unpermitted log cabin can trigger fines of $1,000 for every code violation, and occupancy permits are routinely denied. The numbers tell the story. Between 1930 and 1990, the rate of new homestead cabins dropped by 67%. Where once a family could carve out a future with their own hands, now the forest stands silent, the old skills boxed in by red tape and the promise of safety. In the 20th place, steam donkeys once ruled the backwoods. Iron horses belching smoke, dragging 10-ton logs over slopes too steep for horses or men. Crews fired up these portable steam winches at dawn, feeding cordwood into roaring boilers and threading thick cables through endless forest. A single donkey could haul timber a quarter mile, laying the groundwork for railroads, sawmills, and whole towns. But as the decades turned, the law tightened its grip. OSHA's pressure vessel rules demanded licensed boiler operators and regular inspections, turning every breakdown into a potential $10,000 fine. In 1978, the EPA classified steam donkeys as stationary sources under new emission standards, forcing operators to install costly pollution controls or shut down. By 1975, the number of working steam donkeys had dropped by 80%, the cost of compliance driving family crews out of the woods. Today, in 38 states, running an unlicensed steam donkey is not just risky, it is illegal. The old rhythm of pistons and whistles gave way to silence, the last of the timber titans left rusting beneath the pines. In the 19th place, open-flame pine tar kilns once burned day and night at the edge of the woods, their thick smoke curling through the pines. Old lumber camps depended on homemade tar and wood pitch to waterproof sled runners, patch boots, and seal log cabins against the rain. The process was as simple as it was dangerous. Stack split pine, light a slow fire, and capture the dark resin as it dripped from makeshift kilns. For generations, this sticky black gold kept winter transport moving and tools from rotting in the damp. That all changed in 1974, when the Clean Air Act's hazardous air pollutant list singled out pine tar kilns as uncontrolled sources of toxic emissions. Suddenly, a centuries-old craft was recast as a chemical hazard. Fines reached $4,000 per illicit kiln, and by the end of the decade, 95% of traditional tar operations had vanished. Today, in 36 states, firing up a backyard pitch kiln risks prosecution, a smoky mystique pierced by the sharp edge of modern regulation. In the 18th place, winter ice roads once carved a frozen lifeline through the swamps and muskeg of the northern woods. When the lakes and bogs locked up in January, crews would cut a path across the marsh, flooding the surface and letting it freeze glass hard. then hauling sledges loaded with timber where no summer wagon could pass. These ice roads didn't just connect logging camps, they stitched together whole barter economies, letting families trade firewood for flour or logs for medicine before the thaw. But the cold ingenuity of frost highways ran headlong into a new regime. The 1998 Alaska Wetlands Protection Act, followed by a cascade of state and federal wetland rules, made it illegal to alter or traverse protected wetlands without a permit. In Fairbanks, one family crew was fined $7,000 for cutting a shortcut across a frozen bog, an act that, for generations, was simply called surviving the winter. Since 2000, 88% of historic ice road routes have been lost to legal barriers. What was once a seasonal adaptation to the land is now a crime in 34 states. The old tracks erased by bureaucracy and the slow, relentless creep of red tape. In the 17th place, timber didn't always change hands for cash. On the Montana frontier, a ledger might show a cord of spruce traded for a wagon wheel, or a stack of split pine exchanged for sacks of flour when the river froze and money ran thin. These barter trades ran deep. Neighbors, logging camps, and even small towns survived on a handshake and a tally in a dog-eared notebook. But by 1994, the IRS drew a hard line. The new 1099-B rule demanded that every trade be reported as taxable income, even if no dollar ever changed hands. Suddenly, a load of barter timber could trigger a $250 penalty for every unreported deal. IRS audits swept through rural counties, treating the old system as tax evasion. Barter volume collapsed by 70% in just 3 years. Where once a family could swap logs for medicine or winter feed, now every trade risked a letter stamped in red ink. The ledgers of the barter age sit locked in county archives, testimony to a rural economy choked off by forms and fines, long before the chainsaws fell silent. 16th place, logging with dynamite once turned deep woods into instant clearings and tangled log jams into open water with the press of a plunger. Crews in the Sierra Nevada, as early as 1935, set off low-order charges to drop old-growth giants where axes failed, or to break up river blockades too dangerous for men to tackle by hand. The thunder of a blast could echo for miles, a raw display of frontier ingenuity and risk. But the era of dynamite in the hands of working families ended when the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms rewrote the rules. The 1970 introduction of the ATF 607K explosives license put the power of blasting under federal lock and key. No more buying sticks at the general store. Every stick now demanded a permit, background checks, and strict record keeping. The cost of a single violation surged to $100,000, and by 1995, legal use of explosives in logging had dropped by 92%. For those who kept blasting without paperwork, the risk shifted from physical danger to criminal prosecution. What was once a tool of survival became a courtroom liability, and the echo of those blasts faded, replaced by the silence of regulations and the memory of a wilder, more desperate time. In the 15th place, hand-woven rope bridges once stitched together the wildest corners of logging country. Crews twisted thick hemp lines, lashed them to trees, and stretched swinging spans across deep ravines, sometimes sturdy enough for a wagon, sometimes just wide enough for a man and his axe. These crossings weren't feats of showmanship. They were lifelines, built in hours when the only alternative was a day's detour or a dangerous ford. Today, the simple act of stringing a rope bridge is tangled in red tape. Since 2005 U.S. Forest Service Bridge Safety Order 2200.1, every bridge, no matter how temporary, requires an engineer's stamp and compliance with modern load ratings. Failure to comply risks a $1,000 fine, and by the year 2000, 85% of these makeshift crossings had vanished from public land. Museums still demonstrate the old craft, but on working ground, the law demands steel, concrete, and paperwork. The code may promise safety, but the old sense of daring, crossing a gorge on nothing but hand-laid rope, has all but disappeared, leaving only stories and a few faded photos. In the 14th place, hunting and fishing. Inside logging camps once meant the difference between a full belly and going hungry. When the stew pot ran low, a crew might send its best shot into the woods for venison or cast a line for brook trout before dawn. In the Pacific Northwest, river pigs sometimes hunted deer along the banks after a long day breaking log jams, swapping stories of the biggest buck brought down with a camp rifle. These weren't sport outings, they were a lifeline, supplementing meager rations and keeping a hard-working crew on its feet through the lean months. But as wildlife populations dwindled and state quotas tightened, the law closed in. By 1973, Alaska introduced the Camp Harvest Permit, strictly limiting what could be taken for camp use. Across the lower 48, new statutes set hard limits on game and fish, and unlicensed harvest drew $500 fines, enough to cripple a small crew. Over the next 2 decades, the number of active camp harvest permits dropped by 78%. What was once a matter of survival became a citation waiting in the trees, the quiet of the woods broken not by a rifle shot, but by the snap of a ticket book. In the 13th place, mixing chainsaw fuel by hand was once a daily ritual at the edge of every logging camp. Early saws demanded a precise blend, gasoline hauled in battered jerry cans, oil measured by eye, all swirled together in open barrels right beside the timber. The hiss of fuel, the tang in the air, and the risk of a flash fire were part of the job, not a violation. In the 1970s, chainsaw demonstrations in Oregon drew crowds eager to see these machines roar to life on homemade mixes. But the legal tide turned with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976. Suddenly, any on-site fuel mixing over 55 gallons triggered hazardous waste rules. By 1975, the EPA's generator rule classified leftover fuel as regulated waste, and a single unmarked drum could cost a crew $3,000 in fines. Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality made headlines with a crackdown that slashed homemade mixing by 90%. Today, in nearly every state, the old blend and pour method is a ticket to bankruptcy or prosecution, a chemical hazard squeezed out by regulation, leaving only memories of the fuel-soaked mornings that once powered the woods. In the 12th place, hand-felling giant old-growth trees once stood as the ultimate test of skill and grit in the woods. 2 men, a cross-cut saw, and a Douglas fir towering 200 feet above the moss. This was not just a job, it was a rite of passage. In the Pacific Northwest, sepia-toned photos capture crews dwarfed by trunks thicker than a wagon is long, the teeth of their saws biting through centuries of growth. The rhythm of steel on wood echoed for miles, but every swing carried risk. OSHA changed the rules in 1974, introducing Section 1910.212 and demanding machine guards even on hand tools. Suddenly, a missed guard or a slip of the saw could trigger a $13,653 fine, and the liability for injury became too steep for family crews. By 1970, hand felling of old growth had collapsed by 75%. Where once a pair of men could drop a forest giant with sweat and teamwork, the clang of axe has been replaced by the bang of a gavel. Today, in most states, putting a saw to an ancient fir without industrial permits is an invitation to prosecution, not praise. In the 11th place, open riverbank log storage once lined the Penobscot and Columbia with sprawling piles of timber, stacked high for weeks on muddy banks as crews waited for the next surge downstream. These seasonal booms were more than a convenience, and they were a lifeline, staging the entire year's harvest until the river ran deep enough to float it out. But the law turned against this simple practice in 1979, when the Clean Water Act Section 404 reclassified even benign log piles as fill material. Suddenly, what had been the backbone of local timber economies became a regulatory hazard. Every log left on the bank without a core permit risked a $15,000 fine. And the case of the Penobscot Boom House, once the nerve center of Maine's drives, became a cautionary tale after salmon mortality was traced to suffocating log debris. By the early 1980s, 82% of legal storage capacity vanished, forcing crews to abandon riverside staging and pushing small operators out of the trade. The river's rush, once muted only by ice and flood, fell silent under the weight of federal statute. A world where timber could no longer rest, even for a season, without the threat of prosecution. In the 10th place, homemade logging railroads once snaked through the backwoods on rails laid by hand, narrow-gauge tracks forged from scrap steel and timber. These bootstrapped lines let family crews haul heavy logs out of deep valleys where no wagon could pass, linking isolated cuts to the mills and the distant railroad. The clang of hammers driving spikes, the rattle of makeshift carts rolling over uneven rails, and the teamwork it took to keep a train moving on frost-heaved ground. This was the heartbeat of a logging camp. But when the Federal Railroad Administration's Part 213 safety standards landed in 1970, the era of do-it-yourself rail ended overnight. Every mile of track now had to meet industrial-grade specs, from ballast depth to gauge precision, or risk a $20,000 fine per violation. Inspectors found that over 70% of these tracks failed to comply, and most were torn up or abandoned. The law drew a hard red line. No more homemade railroads, no more timber moved on community ingenuity. The woods fell silent, the last hand-laid rails rusting beneath the ferns, as the march of regulation erased another chapter of rural independence. In the 9th place, the scent of wood smoke once drifted through the camps at dusk, as cooks stoked open fire pits right on the forest floor. These weren't backyard barbecues, they were lifelines, feeding dozens of hungry hands after a day swinging axes and hauling timber. Iron kettles hung from greenwood tripods, bread baked in Dutch ovens buried in coals, and stews simmered over flames fueled by split logs. The communal hearth wasn't just a meal, it was a nightly ritual that built camaraderie and kept spirits high in the cold and wet. But the crackle faded as fire codes crept into the woods. The 1990 California Fire Code, Section 704, set the tone. Open fire pits in wildland areas became a violation, with fines reaching $1,000 for a single unauthorized blaze. State after state followed suit, citing wildfire risk and air pollution. By the late 1990s, 88% of forest fire pits had vanished from logging country, replaced by propane stoves and fire bans. What was once the heart of camp life now risks a citation, and the old stories of bread and beans by firelight survive only in memory, snuffed out by the long arm of regulation. In the 8th place, the thunder of draft horses once echoed through the timber camps, their breath steaming in the morning chill as they hauled sleds loaded with logs over frozen ground. These teams were more than muscle. They were partners in survival, trusted to navigate tangled trails where no machine could pass. Old-timers knew every horse by name, measuring a day's work in cords moved and hooves worn raw. But the world changed when the 1985 amendment to the USDA's Animal Welfare Act set strict standards for animal labor, mandating rest periods, veterinary checks, and transport limits that small crews couldn't afford. The fine for overworking a horse now runs up to $2,000 per violation, and most states require commercial horse loggers to carry insurance and submit to routine inspections. Mechanization swept in, and with it, the number of horse logging crews fell by 80%. Where hoofbeats once marked the pulse of the woods, paperwork and permits now rule. Today, only a handful of operations, working under special permits, keep the old ways alive. The rest consigned to parades and heritage shows, a living tradition trampled under the weight of regulation. Number 7. The night settled heavy over remote logging camps where crews bunked under canvas, huddled in lean-tos, or dug out a patch of earth for a latrine pit just beyond the firelight. For generations, this was home. Rough, cold, and utterly off-grid, but it was the price of reaching the deep timber. The only lights were kerosene lanterns and the stars. Water came from the nearest creek, and sanitation meant a shovel and a spot behind the tent. By the mid-1980s, those nights were numbered. Oregon's 1986 Health Code Section 123.5 made it illegal to house laborers without potable water, flush toilets, and electricity, even in the wildest corners of the forest. Inspectors arrived unannounced, measuring tent distances and counting hand-washing stations. A single violation could bring a $500 fine, a sum that could break a family crew. Within 5 years, 73% of independent camps vanished, forced out or absorbed by corporate outfits with prefab bunkhouses and permanent utilities. The quiet of the woods, once broken only by laughter and the crackle of the fire, now echoed with the footsteps of regulators and the slow fade of an outlawed way of life. Number 6. The clang of hammer on steel once echoed through the woods as Camp Blacksmith fired up homemade charcoal forges to reforge axes, mend chains, and temper saw blades on the spot. In the heart of a logging camp, the forge was more than a workshop, it was a lifeline. Broken tools didn't mean lost wages or a trip to town. A skilled hand could draw out a fresh edge from scrap and coal, keeping a crew swinging through the hardest timber. But that independence came under fire when the EPA's 1972 Resource Conservation and Recovery Act swept small-scale metalwork into the same regulatory dragnet as full-blown factories. Suddenly, the smoke and quench water from a camp forge counted as hazardous emissions. In 1985, a Wyoming family crew was slapped with a $6,000 fine for running an unpermitted forge, enough to wipe out a season's pay. The crackdown was swift. Over 85% of on-site blacksmith setups vanished within a decade. Where once the ring of steel meant survival, now it risks a citation, and the lost art of tool forging survives mostly in museum corners and reenactments. The sharp axes it produced enabled the next, even riskier cuts. Now both the skill and the edge are blunted by regulation. Number 5. The sharp ring of an axe once echoed right up to the water's edge. For generations, crews worked the prime timber lining creeks and rivers, felling white pine and hemlock within arm's reach of the current. These riparian stands grew tall and clean, fetching top dollar and anchoring entire family operations. But the law drew a hard red line with the 1976 Clean Water Act Section 404B, carving out a 100-foot buffer zone where cutting became a ticket to heavy fines. In Pennsylvania, a single creekside cut led to an $8,000 penalty, a warning shot that sent shockwaves through small crews. The U.S. Forest Service tracked a 68% drop in stream bank harvesting after the rule took hold. Where once the best logs went straight from riverbank to mill, the buffer statute cordoned off the richest ground, protecting water and habitat, but cutting the legs out from under the old economic model. The photo of a lumberjack felling spruce beside a winding creek now stands as both evidence and elegy, a way of life hemmed in by regulation, the edge dulled not by time, but by statute. Number 4. The family logging crew once stood at the heart of the American woods. A portrait of grandparents, parents, and children side by side, sleeves rolled, horses hitched, and every acre earned with sweat and trust. These weren't faceless workers. They were names in the census, owners of their own claims, feeding towns and raising barns with the timber they hauled. But the rules changed. The 1970 introduction of OSHA's record-keeping and the Fair Labor Standards Act's overtime mandates buried these crews in paperwork. Every hour logged, every cut documented, every pay stub scrutinized. A single missing form could trigger a $13,500 fine, enough to wipe out a whole season's profit. By 1985, 74% of independent crews in Michigan had vanished, forced out by compliance costs and the threat of penalties. What once was a legacy passed from father to son became a casualty of forms and fear. As the family crew faded, many turned to winter trapping just to stay afloat, a side hustle born of necessity when the woods closed to those who couldn't keep up with the paperwork. The warmth of family tradition chilled beneath the weight of regulation, and the woods grew quieter, one more chapter of rural independence erased by the march of bureaucracy. Number 3. The winter trapping lines once snaked through the snow beyond every logging camp, a lifeline when the timber checks ran thin and the stew pot threatened to run dry. In the deep cold, crews set steel traps for beaver and muskrat along frozen creeks, checking lines before dawn, skinning pelts by lantern light, and trading fur for flour, boots, or a few precious dollars at the spring thaw. The skill was more than side income. It was survival, woven into the rhythm of camp life and the memory of every hard winter. But the world shifted with the 1975 Federal Trapping Act and a wave of state conservation laws. Suddenly, every trap demanded a permit, every pelt a paper trail. The fines for unlicensed trapping surged to $300 per animal. And by 1990, the number of legal traps in the northern woods had fallen by 80%. The photo of a beaver caught in a steel-jawed trap now stands as evidence of a vanished economy, one sacrificed in the name of wildlife protection. The moral line sharpened, animal populations rebounded, but the last, lean safety net for rural camps was cut away. The old-timers called it the end of winter's second harvest, a skill outlawed, a way of life erased by the slow grind of regulation. Number 2, the crack of axes and the thud of split logs once echoed through the woods as whole towns turned out for the firewood cut. In the dead of winter, neighbors gathered to fell, limb, and split enough cordwood to heat every home from the river to the ridge, fueling stoves, schoolhouses, and church halls until spring's thaw. The work was brutal, hands blistered, backs bent, and every swing meant survival, not just for one family, but for entire communities. By the early 1970s, this tradition met a wall of paperwork. New York's 1971 firewood harvest permit set the tone, demanding not just a saw and sweat, but a state-issued license and per-cord fees that priced out communal cuts. The cost of a permit surged, and a missed form could bring a $4,000 fine, enough to wipe out a winter's savings. Across the country, firewood harvest dropped by 71% as families abandoned the old ways, replaced by commercial haulers and utility bills. The sight of 100 hands splitting cords for the town faded, the buzz of saws drowned out by the drone of regulation. A communal skill, outlawed in all but memory. And finally, in first place, the community timber harvest stands as the lost heart of the old woods. Once, whole valleys would gather, dozens of families, neighbors, and crews, felling, hauling, and sharing timber without a single outside signature. The law now forms a wall. Federal permits, state plans, multi-agency reviews, each one stacking higher since the 1970s. In Oregon, a single UN-permitted harvest drew $120,000 fine in 1993. The statutory ceiling for timber theft now reaches $250,000. The U.S. Forest Service's 2020 data shows a near-total collapse. Less than 1% of the old communal cuts survive. The skills that built homes, heated towns, and bound communities are all but outlawed. If even a single skill endures, learn it and carry forward a piece of what was lost. Across all 25 outlawed skills, one truth cuts through. Regulation and consolidation didn't just tame wild forests, they outlawed the hard-won independence of ordinary people. Barter, sweat, and self-reliance once built entire economies where law is now drawn in ink, not axe marks. What vanished isn't just technique, but the right to shape your own survival. The forest is quieter now, but so are the voices of those who lived by its code. Drop your thoughts below.